morning. Welcome to Matheson Library. My name is Amy Sullivan, and I'm the Director of Library Services here at the library. I know this looks maybe kind of strange that I'm holding, but this is a microphone, and this is going to be used possibly at the end of our presentation today. We might have a question and answer or sharing kind of bit at the end that you guys can use this, and I'm hoping that you all will, as I drop this, toss it to each other. It's very durable, so you don't have to, it picks up really well, and that way we could, our TV crew who's here filming today could pick up that sound because we're doing a Facebook Live event today. So please use this when you have any comments or questions so that we can all hear you. I appreciate that. We do have refreshments today, so please help yourself if you haven't already, and you might be able to even get some seconds. So thank you for joining us today. We also have a display of celebrating Women's History because this is why we're having this event today. This month is Women's History Month, and we have a display as you came in. If you missed that, please check it out before you leave. It is full of some materials that are celebrating Women's History Month, and I hope you will enjoy that as well. And it is my pleasure today to be able to welcome you to Ms. Legatha Spelbring's event, Extraordinary Kentucky Women Who Cross Society's Boundaries. Legatha Spelbring is an associate professor of English and instructor for women's studies and has taught at WKCTC for 15 years. Besides her interest in women's studies, Legatha enjoys traveling and is a supporter of Matheson Library. Please join us in welcoming Legatha. She recognizes some of the women of Kentucky who were not held back by race or gender and who are responsible for the rights today's women enjoy. Please welcome Legatha Spelbring.
Thank you very much for being here, even those of you I had to bribe a little bit. I really appreciate you being here. When I was asked to do this, my first thought was, okay, I'm going to start back in the 1800s and work my way up to the present time. It took about 5 minutes of research to realize, I'm not probably leaving much of the 1800s, because when I got into the research of these women who overcame so many things during a time in our country when women weren't supposed to do those things. They were supposed to stay home, get married, take care of the children. I thought, these are the women we need to know about. In my experience in high school way back when, we didn't learn very much about women. I could probably name 5 or 6 women that were mentioned in our history class. It was mainly his story, literally. So I'm really happy today to get to share some of these women with you. But what I want to do is to actually set the context in which these women lived. And so the way I'm going to do that is to actually move forward to the 1960s. And I'm going to show you some of the things that women could not do in the 1960s. A woman could not get a credit card in her own name. Until 1974, women had to have a male co-signer. Could be a father, a brother, a husband, for any kind of loan, whether it was a mortgage, whether she had a great job or not, and she was making her own money, she still had to have that man come in and do that co-signing. Oftentimes, women were asked whether or not they planned to become pregnant if they were on birth control, because the loaners did not want them to get pregnant and quit their jobs and not be able to pay for it. Many times, until the Discrimination Act of 1978, women could be fired for getting pregnant. That's not that long ago. When you really think about it, this is not that long ago at all. Many lost their jobs in teaching, office work, and other careers because men believed that pregnant women would quit once they gave birth. So before 1970, in many states, women lost their jobs when they married, and they would sometimes keep their marriages secret so that they wouldn't lose their jobs. Reporting sexual harassment in the workplace. there was really nothing in place that protected women from that until 1980, when it was finally officially defined as being sexual harassment in the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Before 1980, women, the only choice they had was to put up with it or to quit the job. No fault, you could not get a no-fault divorce. In most states, the only way that you could get a divorce was if your husband committed adultery. In some states, they did recognize alienation of affection or irreconcilable differences, but for the most part, if you were being physically, sexually, or emotionally abused, that was not grounds for a woman to get a divorce. Obtain a safe legal abortion. Estimates of the number of illegal abortions in the 1950s and 60s ranged from 200,000 to 1.2 million. It's a big difference there. One analysis from North Carolina concluded that an estimated 829,000 illegal or self-induced abortions occurred in 1967. This was before the Roe versus Wade. And so hundreds of women died of infection and blood loss from either self-induced abortions or going to places where they really didn't have a safe place to do that. Sex education was not provided by most parents or public schools, except the very, very basics. As I was born in 1950, and I'm not sure that I even heard the word pregnant until I was a teenager. My mother wouldn't even say that word, you know? And so I got the very basics. It's just don't do it, you know, was the main thing. Purchase contraceptive devices and medications to control her own fertility. Before 1965, birth control devices and medications, it was illegal to purchase them. That is just hard for us to imagine now, isn't it? And finally, the Supreme Court ruled that that could happen. So millions of unmarried women in 26 states were still denied birth control after the Supreme Court made that decision. Access to contraceptions regardless of marital status, finally, women were able to do that in 1972. Own and control property in her own name. Originally in the United States, once a woman married, she became chattel. She became property of her husband. And if she did have property before that marriage, it became his. If she had a job, he could take her money. Nothing really belonged to her. It was really, in a way, it was better to be single. You could have property in your name, but you still had to have a guardian that oversaw what it was. So not until 1981 was the full end of that legal subordination of a wife to her husband finally did occur. Also, getting a loan in her own name. 1974, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act passed the U.S. Congress. And again, until then, if you were single, widowed, divorced, you had to have that co-signer go along with you to the bank. The problem is, even though if you were making a certain amount of money, they could take that down a certain percentage, sometimes as much as 50%, instead of counting all of your income in order to make that loan. A lot of craziness. Have equal employment opportunity in applying for and being hired for jobs. In 1964, the Federal Civil Rights Act included Title VII, when guaranteed equal opportunity in employment. It is supposed to end discrimination by gender, age, sex, and disability. And we know that that wasn't always the case, that happened. Identify the concept of domestic violence. In 1994, Congress passed the Violence Against Women Act, which funds services for victims of rape and domestic violence. As late as the 70s and 80s, police were very reluctant to get involved. they would be called and they would go, but what they would do is try to diffuse the situation, talk the man down, and then they would leave. Well, we know that when they left, it could escalate again. They weren't getting the women to safety. The first shelter in the U.S. for battered women operated in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1974. There are more animal shelters in our country than there are shelters for women who are abused, by thousands. Be eligible for most jobs in the U.S. Armed Services. During World War I and II, thousands of women served in supporting roles. In 1970, the first women were promoted to brigadier general in the Army. In 1972, the ROTC opened to Army and Navy women. In 1976, the first group of women were admitted to the U.S. military academies, West Point and the Air Force Academy. In 2010, the U.S. Navy authorized women to serve on submarines for the first time. And in 1988, NASA selected the first woman astronaut. Applying for most types of civilian jobs. In the 1960s, the jobs open to women included secretary, teacher, nurse, librarian, maid, hairstylist, and cook. For the most part, that was it. I remember when I was in high school and I was a senior, I finally got a call from our counselor, and she brought me into her office, and she said, "Do you want to be a nurse?" I said, "No." She said, "Okay," and that was it, you know? So I didn't know there were even those opportunities for me to take out there even for that, you know. And we certainly were not encouraged to go into medicine and do things in that nature as far as being the doctor. You could become the nurse, but for a woman to become a doctor, that was quite a deal. But now we have more. The last statistic I saw was that 57% of the bachelor's degrees are earned by women now. So we're outdoing the men on the college education. Be accepted at graduate schools and some male-only colleges and universities. In the late 1960s, women made up a tiny fraction of the students admitted to law schools and medical schools, less than 1%. And in 1972, Title IX opened the door for women to become doctors, lawyers, and engineers. In 1981, the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court, Judge Sandra Day O'Connor, was appointed by President Reagan. Have opportunities to participate in school sports. That was in 1972. Serve on a jury. This I found just shocking parts of this. Women were excluded from serving on juries until 1957 in many states, and until 1994, women could be excluded from juries without cause if one of the attorneys objected. As late as 1942, only 28 states allowed women to serve as jurors, but women had the right to claim exemption based on their sex. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 gave women the right to serve on federal juries, but not until 1973 could women serve on juries in all states. Well, it was up to the state to decide whether or not women could serve on their state juries, okay? Kentucky was pretty progressive in that, because once that 19th Amendment was ratified and women were allowed to vote, then Kentucky allowed women to serve on their state juries. I was born in Mississippi. I graduated school in Arkansas, but I was born in Mississippi. In 1968, you could not serve on a state jury in Mississippi, not until 1968. That was the year I graduated from high school. So if I had stayed in Mississippi and gotten into trouble by the time, you know, in my 17 years and had to be tried, my jury would have been all men. And that just blows your mind. So by putting that to context and seeing that it really hasn't been that many years since we've gained some of these freedoms. It's not been that long ago. When we're talking the 60s and 70s, and the amount of time, that is a small window of time. So I think knowing that, and then meeting these women during that time period even before we were granted these things, you really see what these women were brave, and they were spunky, and they didn't let anyone tell them that they couldn't do what they wanted to do. I included Carrie Nations because I think she's probably one person we've all heard about. And she's from Kentucky, from Garrett County. She was born in 1846. Now, I've put these women in order not by their importance at all. I think they're all important. I simply went by the year they were born and worked my way up with that. She was quite spunky herself. She was very notorious in wanting to get rid of alcohol. Evidently, she grew up in an alcoholic family, and that made her really determined to get that out of the reach of people. And so when she would have to go to court, they would talk about the fact that she addressed the judges as your dishonor instead of the honor. So she was quite the character. Lauric Clay from Fayette County was born in 1849. She organized and served as the first president of the Kentucky Equal Rights Association, which secured rights for women through legislative change in education, property, rights, and wages. In the 1890s, Clay became affiliated with the National American Suffrage Association and established the organizations for that in 9 states. So she traveled throughout the country working to get women the right to vote. Emma Guy Cromwell from Simpson County was born in 1865. She began her political career by being elected by the Senate as the state librarian. So librarians can do all kinds of things. In 1896. In 1924, she was elected Secretary of State, making her the first woman elected to a statewide office of Kentucky. Mary Elliott Flannery from Carter County, born in 1867, was the first woman elected to the Kentucky State Legislature and was named Kentucky's most prominent by the Kentucky Historical Society. She really worked for things that people needed. They needed jobs, they needed good roads, they needed those good schools. And she focused on Kentucky's marriage and divorce laws, education reform, and sponsored the Shepherd-Towner Maternity Act, which provided federal funding for maternity and child care. And she also introduced the bill that created Morehead State Teachers College. Madeleine Mcdowell Breckinridge from Fayette County, 1872. She was regarded by some as being very militant. She was one of Kentucky's most active suffragists and a fervent supporter of that 19th Amendment. Luckily, she was married to the Lexington Herald's leader's editor, so she took advantage of that, and she wrote articles for the paper in which she really emphasized those civic and social issues and the rights of women to be able to vote. Mary Willie Arvin from Henderson County. She's Kentucky's most decorated woman veteran of World War I. She was born in 1879, born in Henderson. She joined the American Red Cross and was stationed in France in 1918 when those German bombs fell. She didn't leave those wounded soldiers. She stayed with them. And so she was recognized by France, England, and the United States for doing her job and being compassionate and taking care of those soldiers. Sophia Kendrick Alcorn from Boyle, I'm probably going to say that right, was born in 1883. She was a teacher at the Kentucky School of the Deaf, and she developed the Tad Oman method for teaching children who are deaf and or blind that is used internationally today. These method teaches children how to speak through touching their teacher's cheek and feeling those vocal vibrations. Allison Dunnington from Logan County, born in 1906, was an internationally known reporter. At 13, she began writing a weekly column on Russellville happenings for the Owensboro Enterprise. In 1947, she became the managing head of the Associated Negro Press and the first African-American woman accredited to cover the White House, the U.S. State Department, and the U.S. Supreme Court. In addition, in 1951, she was the first African-American woman to cover the presidential tour, and she became the first woman to receive the Capitol Press Club Best All-Around Newsman for 1951, and in 1961, she served on the Committee of the Equal Employment Opportunity. The fact that this woman was born in 1906, an African-American woman, to be able during that time period to accomplish what she did is absolutely amazing. It speaks a lot to her tenacity and her character to take that on. Willa Beatrice Brown was born in 1906. She is an absolutely amazing woman also. In an era harsh for both women and African Americans, Brown began flight lessons at Chicago's Aeronautical University in 1934. In 1937, she received both a master's degree from Northwestern University and her pilot's license, making her the first African American woman to be licensed to fly in the United States. In 1939, she received her commercial pilot's license, making her the first African American woman to make a career of aviation and the person most responsible for preparing African Americans for World War II. Nearly 200 of the 2,000 pilots she trained were known as the Tuskegee Airmen. And I think most of us hopefully have heard of the Tuskegee Airmen, but did you know that 200 of them or more were trained by a woman, an African American woman? I'd never heard of that before. So I got a little bit of a video here for you, hopefully.
With the hint of war in the late 1930s, Willa Beatrice Brown of Glasgow saw an opportunity not only for herself, but for other African Americans in the new field of aviation. Armed with a business degree from Indiana University and a master's degree from Northwestern University, Willa sought a career challenge outside the limited fields normally open to women or to people of color. She wanted to fly. She continued her education at Chicago's Aeronautical University, and 2 years later obtained her commercial pilot's license and her master aviation mechanics license. Willa was stunning in both beauty and intellect. Wearing boots, leather jacket, and jodhpurs, she attracted attention everywhere she went, cleverly promoting the image of the black aviator. She convinced black newspapers to cover air shows and helped organize the National Airmen's Association of America. She lobbied Washington, and together with her good friend Mary McLeod Bethune, wrote Eleanor Roosevelt about integrating America's aviation forces. In 1939, the Coffee School of Aeronautics, which Willa and her husband Cornelius owned, became the only non-university connected flight school to be funded by the civilian pilot training program to train black pilots. Many white flight schools were funded, but Willa was the only woman, black or white, to operate a flight school. She was also the first black woman to become an officer in the Civilian Air Patrol. It could well be said that these three women, the forward-thinking Willa Beatrice Brown, the wise and supportive Mary McLeod Bethune, and the progressive-thinking Eleanor Roosevelt set in motion a chain of events that eventually led to the desegregation of the United States Armed Forces. Willa trained more than 2,000 black cadets at the Coffey School of Aeronautics. In time, nearly 200 of these aviators formed the squadron better known as the legendary Tuskegee Airmen. In 1948, Willa's goal of integrating African-American pilots into the U.S. Army Air Corps was achieved when President Harry Truman signed an executive order integrating the American military armed forces. It was a time of change for black soldiers, but also for black women. With role models like Anna Mack Clark and Willa Brown, more and more they courageously pushed for race and gender equality at the same time.
Amazing to me that she didn't let, I've done something, that she did not let, how do I get that back? She didn't let her race, she didn't let the fact that she was a woman stop her from doing what she wanted to do, what she felt was important to do. We can all take lessons from that. Okay. This is a local, Alamo Wallace Leash. She was born in Keville, Kentucky. She's buried in Paducah. She was born in 1917. And she was an artist, and I think it's very appropriate to have her, you know, when we think about Paducah, art is really important to our city. She worked with fabric. The research, I found that she started her first quilt when she was 5 years old, so she started early with that. She became, she was a pioneer of the contemporary crafts movement, and she became internationally well known for her work with fabrics and found objects. Many of her works reflected her childhood, the farm and that country rural setting that she grew up with. She was named Master Craftsman by the World Crafts Council in 1974, received Kentucky Governor's Award in 1987. She had a studio in Bullitt County and lived there for a while, but then she was brought back to Paducah. So she's one that we can certainly claim as our own. This woman is another absolutely remarkable woman. Anna Mack Clark from Anderson County, born in 1919. She was one of the first African-American Kentucky women to enlist during World War II in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. When promoted to a platoon leader in 1943, Clark became the first African-American WMC to command a white platoon. That's a big deal. That is a big deal that she did that. And was instrumental in desegregation of Douglas Army Airfield in Douglas, Arizona. She died at the age of 25, and I have to think, what would she have accomplished? What else would she have done if she had survived? She had appendicitis, the surgery went well, but then she got an infection and gangrene and passed away. But amazing things to accomplish for someone at that age and, you know, at that race. There are so many, if you start doing research, there are so many women that have had so much to do with not just helping women in this country, but anytime you bring a group up, everyone's brought up, you know? And so when women were able to do more things, it not only helped women, it helped men also. You know, we all grow from that. We all have women in our lives who have been very influential for us. They don't have to be well known. They don't have to be internationally known. And so I'm just going to kind of open it up and let you share someone in your life, that an influential woman that you feel really made a difference in your life. Okay?
And you get to be the first one to use
To use the box. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Enjoyed your presentation. I just want to mention and remember, there have been many influential women in my life, but since I'm here on the campus of West Kentucky, I want to talk about Mary G. Sledd. Is anyone here familiar with her?
I'm not. Are you? You are probably.
Did somebody say yes?
Somebody? Oh,
Okay.
Anita is.
Well, she was very influential in the lives of many students who attended West Kentucky out at the Thompson Avenue location. I graduated from there in 1967. So, and then I just saw some of the booklets that you have, so you know that has a very long and rich history. So she was very influential, a very great woman. I know she was highlighted in the Paducah Sun, you know, many times for her work and her contribution. Just a very loving woman, and she has quite a history as well of some of the things that she had to endure to get where she was. So I just kind of wanted to remember her today during History Month for Women.
Thank you so much. Very much. Okay, next. Anyone else? Don't be shy. Okay, I'm going to share my influential woman. And it's not someone that you're going to see in the headlines, and you're not going to find magazine articles about her, but her name was Lucy Spelbring, and she was my mother-in-law. And she was one of the spunkiest women I ever met in my life. She was born in 1918, but she was a very independent woman, and she didn't want to just get married, which was what she was supposed to do. You know, during that time period, she wanted to have her own money. So she went to school and became a cosmetologist, a beautician. And she loved that job, but then she met Herschel Spelbring and got married. Well, she was supposed to quit that job, and so she did what she was supposed to do, and she stopped working. But she found out, and it didn't take very long for her to realize, this is not working for me. That's not who I am. I want to be able to also have my career. So she decided to open her own beauty shop in the little town of Poland, Indiana. And when her in-laws found out about it, they paid her a visit, and they said, we do not approve of this. I think their fear was that the neighbors would think they couldn't afford to support her. You know, that her husband couldn't afford to support her, and that's not what women were supposed to do. So they said, you can't do this, and we are not going to give you any money toward it. She said, that's fine. So she went and got her own money, and she opened it and had that business for over 60 years and raised her family there in rural. So when I think of her, I think of all the things that she didn't let anyone force her into something that she didn't want to do. And she became a person in the community that if anyone needed something or needed something to get done, she was the one they came to. And so she wasn't afraid to go up against anybody, you know. And I think we need to learn from those women. I think many times we hold back because of what society thinks we should be doing, or we're so afraid to take a risk that we'll embarrass ourselves. You know, we all fail many times before we succeed. That's just life, and you cannot be afraid of trying. And I hope by going back and looking at these women who accomplished so much, particularly in a time that it was not supposed to happen. You know, they bucked the system, and they really accomplished a lot of wonderful things. That these women are the women that paved the way for the rest of us to be able to do the things that we want to do. Okay. Any questions?
Okay. Back in the see, I believe it would be right around the early 80s. Our local laborers union, there were no women working there, and it was they did not want women there, period. And it was hard work. However, it was one of the few things, almost the only thing with no education that you could do as a woman would be that physical labor to provide good money. Mm-hmm. So my mother and Diane, her best friend, they grew up together. They were tough as nails, tomboys growing up, real spunky, and well, they just pushed their way in. They went through untold amount of harassment, both sexually and physically and verbally, but they wouldn't quit. They would not quit. And so in our area, I feel like, you know, they paved the way, because in the laborers union now, it's real close to 50-50.
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
there's tons of women in it. And they kind of changed the mindset. The men seemed that they could hang, and they could even outwork some of them. Of course, it would be the lazier ones. So anyway, I think that's very admirable.
It is. It's so important that we recognize those women who have pushed their way in, because they've really made it possible for the rest of us to be able to do the things that we do.
Yeah.
And they're all around us. Like I say, they're not all featured in a magazine or a newspaper. It's women we know day to day that are out there working hard and setting examples for us, you know, that we can use those examples to better ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, there's not a harder job in this world than being a mom and a stay-at-home mom. And I really respect those women who are able to do that, you know, and do it. The wonderful thing now is that we have choices, which we didn't have before. And so now, you know, we have those women that did what your mom and her best friend did to thank for us to be able to have those choices with our lives and to do. And I think until the men saw these women in action, just like you were talking about, they went by the old stereotypes that were passed down from generation to generation as to what women could do and couldn't do. But once you prove yourself, or somebody's proved it, then it's hard for somebody to say, well, you can't hire a woman because here we have Ethel over there that's doing a great job, you know? Any questions or comments, Ken?
I'm gonna toss it.
Well,
She's been dying to throw that thing.
my example is Jenny Boyarsky. I don't know if you knew her. She was the library director before, well, when I was first arrived in 1981. She'd been here since 1968, I think. She was a role model in the sense that, you know, she had a library job, which meant, you know, that's one of the few jobs that women were allowed back then, but she went beyond that role because she was not mousy. She wasn't quiet. She didn't always shush people. She was very professional. She made sure that librarians here were fully part of the faculty in every sense of the word. She was just academic. She was very great management style. She was just a role model in a lot of senses that I could never match up to. So I just have fond memories of her leadership style and her every. You know, she was a role model just not for women librarians, but for any librarian that wanted to look at her and see how to do it. So great example.
Thank
I don't think I can throw it that far.
And he's right. Mrs. Boyarsky was amazing, and she always looked beautiful and sang for all those years. That's what I remember. Her hair would be so perfect. But I had one with my granny, Frida Ann Hayden Cochran, and she was teaching school when she was 13 between the rivers where we came from. And she could just anything. You know, she farmed, she had the incubators with the birds, everything I still like today, but she was a musician, made all her own clothes. And when you were talking about how things have changed so much, she was teaching in the 70s at my county, where the big could a woman you know, because they never had. I remember her tailoring this pants, you know, a treadle machine. All her clothes were so perfect, even on the inside, you know, all the finished seams. And she worked on that pantsuit, you know, strode into the classroom, you know, wearing a pantsuit. And the next day, so
Yay!
good job. Sing and play piano. You know, she came from a family of musicians and mathematicians, so that was what she could do. And she was hard to please. That's what I remember. And I'm kind of glad now that she would plant her beans in the garden. You know, they had to be 6 inches apart. And we'd try to help, and she'd come and she'd be so upset, you know, if you messed up at all. But she taught us to, you know, to try harder. And I loved her for that and miss her. And then the other one, I'm gonna do it to Legatha. I mean to be corny, but she's amazing. And I don't even have to take her thoughts. I just wish you would tell them a little, or else I will, about all you came through to be here. You can do it in 5 minutes like you did at the last meeting.
Can I do it in 5?
You can.
I'll try to do this in 5 minutes. I never had college on my radar because I grew up in rural Mississippi, poor farmers, and we didn't, I never heard the word college mentioned. My parents, neither one had graduated high school, so their goal was for all 4 of their children to graduate high school. But I'm going to move on up the time here because otherwise we won't have time. But I ended up marrying a man, a fantastic man from Indiana, Spelbring, who had a heart attack on our very first anniversary. And they didn't think he was going to live. I was 7 months pregnant, and there he was, you know, had this horrible heart attack. So we, several years went by. We moved back to Indiana, and his health was failing. And so one night, he was a math teacher and a coach. He'd gotten his master's degree at Indiana State. So one night he said, tomorrow I'm taking you to Indiana State and we're signing you up for classes. I said, oh, okay. So during the night I thought, what do I want to be when I grow up, you know? So I decided, well, elementary education, because we had 2 children. I thought we would be on the same schedule. And all that good stuff. So that's what I did. In my first semester, I thought, I can't keep up with these young people coming to school. It's been 18 years since I've been out of school. First semester, I got on the dean's list. I had straight A's. Second semester, I was on the dean's list. And I thought, they're going to figure out I'm a fluke. You know, this can't possibly really be happening. But I did well. I ended up graduating magna cum laude with 3.88 grade point average for my bachelor's. Halfway through my bachelor's degree, Shell passed away, so he never got to see me graduate, but I know he knew, you know. So I went on and remarried. About 10 years down the road, I thought I'd stop teaching because I found out elementary education wasn't really for me. So I was doing other things, and one day I was taking a professor to Indiana State, and I mentioned, well, I would really love to get my master's degree, but I knew I couldn't do it. I couldn't afford to do it. Within 2 weeks, I got a call from my niece who said, she calls me Aunt Gay. She says, Aunt Gay, they're hiring writing teachers at Indiana State. And I said, well, Jamie, they won't hire me to teach at Indiana State. But she says, well, they just hired me. So I stayed up till 12:30. I got my vita, everything ready, you know, that I thought they could possibly want. And I went into the dean's office in the English department, and he had taken the day off. So I thought, well, I won't find out anything today. So I was filling out and the secretary said, well, you know, you have to have your vita, you have to have, I said, well, here it is, my transcript and everything. So I was filling out my application. And she's on the phone. So I go and I hand her my application, and she said, well, now I'm going to take you to your office and get you your books. I said, I got the job. And she said, yeah. She was talking, she called the dean, and he hired me over the phone. Well, and then she said, then you need to go sign up for graduate school. I said, I get to go to school? I had no idea what I was applying for. It was a grad assistant. And she said, we will pay you $5,000 stipend, 80% of your tuition, and you're going to teach 2 classes and take 2 classes a semester. So I still get chills because the night before I almost talked myself out of doing it because I was afraid I would be embarrassed when he said no. And when I think of that, it almost makes me nauseous because this is what I love. Even though I'm retiring, this is what I've loved. This was my niche, you know? That if I hadn't been willing to make that risk, you know, God handed it to me on a platter, but I had to be the one to go for it. And so that's what I hope that my students will learn from me as much as anything, is that you have to be willing to take the risk. Don't ever tell yourself that you can't do something. I absolutely hate that word. You should at least try it. And it may not work out, but you never know where that will lead you to. And that's my story. Thank you. Thank you all so very much for coming. This is my last presentation before I retire. So I appreciate that you all became part of it with me. Thank you very much. You're welcome.